What is the right order to adjust your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO? Wow, this is a very specific question. And congratulations for the question, because that shows me that you are already an experienced photographer, because otherwise you wouldn't be able, or you wouldn't come up with that question. And also congratulations for the decision to not shoot on automatic mode anymore, because I will also clarify in this video later why it's actually a good idea to not always use automatic mode. I also would recommend that you may watch my last video, because I will make some references to this, and just for understanding purposes it might be a good idea. And as always, 90% of the video you can just close your eyes or make your dishes or wash your clothing or whatever, make the laundry, because actually what I show you is not really important. Just listen and concentrate. That's enough most of the time. Okay, I think we're ready to start. Allow me to make a short recap. What makes a picture bright? It's the light. Easy to remember. Okay, so the amount of light which falls into our eye or hits the camera controls the brightness or the exposure of a picture. The more light, the brighter is what we perceive, or the brighter the picture of the camera. Okay, good. What controls the amount of light? Basically, there are two categories. It's the sender, for example, the sun, which is a direct light source, or all the objects around which reflects the light. We had the example of the green leaves and the dark brown trunk, the bark of a tree, which reflects more or less light, which we perceive as lighter or darker. And the other category is the receiver, which in a human case is the eye, or the camera, or better said, the properties of these things. And an eye, we had the eyelid, which basically controls whether 0 or 100% of the light falls in. We have this black hole in the middle, which is the pupil. The smaller the hole, the less light comes in. And we had the photoreceptors of our retina, okay? The more light sensitive they are, the brighter is what we see. And basically we have the same stuff at the camera. The shutter is what closes the camera and blocks 100% of the light outside. And if the shutter is open, the light has the chance to go into the camera. And the longer the shutter is open, the more light can come in and the brighter the picture gets. And look at this turtle. This is a night. It's sunbathing. Okay. That's so dulce. So the longer the shutter is open, the longer the camera gets the chance to collect light. Then there was this crazy thing with the aperture, the same thing with the pupil, this black hole in the middle. And the bigger the hole is, the less light gets blocked out. You remember, this was this blocking device. The more light gets blocked, the bigger this crazy f-stop number is, okay? And then we had the ISO. The ISO is basically the light sensitivity of the film or your sensor. The higher the ISO is, the less light is necessary to expose a scene. I've covered all these topics in detail in the last videos. So, if the shutter speed and the ISO and the aperture control the exposure, what is the difference? I can use anything of these, right? No, not really. There are small differences and I explain them right now. let's start with the shutter speed. Another reference to the last video, you remember that I told that the human eye is able to see 24 different pictures each second, which was like a processing time of 0.04 seconds per picture. And I had this example with this fly sweater, you know, when you try to catch the fly, and basically the human eye is so slow that you see the whole movement of the sweater. You cannot really see, you only see like a blur. And the other thing which I mentioned was that the longer a shutter is open, the more lights gets collected, okay? It just gets brighter and brighter, yes. But there is another thing. The longer the shutter is open, the more pictures gets blended together, okay? What do I mean? If you see this car, okay, this car is moving, and when I open the shutter, the film or the sensor takes each information from each step where the car is, but it makes only one picture. So basically on the picture, the car is everywhere. It's there, it's there, it's there, it's there, all on the same picture. And we call this blur, okay? The car looks blurry because it's not really sharp on any place. And this is basically the same with the sweater, right? So we can simulate the same motion blur in a camera, how the human eye perceives it. How do we do this? Very easy. We take the same shutter speed of the time which our eye needs to process one picture. Which means, you remember, it was 24 pictures each second. Let's make it round, 25. Which means the shutter speed must be at 25th of a second. And if an object is moving, the shutter speed creates motion blur in the same way as our eye does it. You can also remember that a fly is way faster. A fly waits for the sweater because it can see way more pictures. Like, let's say 100, okay? So if you make the shutter speed 100th of a second, then you see the sweater much sharper, because the exposure time is much shorter, which means only a shorter part of this movement is blended into one picture. So let's say the whole movement of the sweater takes 1/10 of a second, okay? 1/10 of a second, okay? And you have the human eye sees 24 pictures a second, which means if this is only 1/10 of a second, we see basically 2.4 pictures of the whole movement, or the whole process of the sweater is merged into 2 to 3 pictures in our brain. So if you use serial mode and you make as much pictures as you can, if you have 100th of a second shutter speed and the whole movement takes 1/10 of a second, you can make exactly 10 pictures in serial mode, which means you see the sweater like 10 times. Relatively sharp, because you always capture like this movement part, and the sweater gets much sharper than if you have the whole movement in one picture or in 2.5 pictures. Wow, okay, this was a little bit, yeah, just think about this again, watch it again. I have to cut this in because while I was editing the video, I was a little bit confused. Everything was correct what I was saying, okay? But I was mixing the topics frame rate and shutter speed, and experienced photographer, they understood everything what I was saying, but this is a tutorial for basics, and if you haven't heard about this ever, then it might have been confused for you. So first let me explain why I took this with the shutter speed. I had this example with a human eye that we can see 24 pictures a second, which means each picture is taken in a 24th of a second. That's clear. So because our eyelid is open the whole time, which is basically the shutter, okay? It's the shutter of the camera, but it's always open. So the whole time when the picture is taken, the whole 24th of a second is like our shutter speed. It's like always open, okay? So this was the reason why I chose a shutter speed of a 24th of a second. And in this example, this is basically the lowest or highest threshold from which direction you come for the shutter speed regarding to our refreshing rate, okay? If the human eye always takes 24 pictures each second, we can maximum expose it for a 25th of a second. We cannot expose it longer, because then we weren't able to make so many pictures each second. So this was the reason that I told, if you had a shorter shutter speed, like 100th of a second, you would be able to make 100 pictures each second, okay? If you want an exposure time from 1 second, if you say every picture shall get an exposure of 1 second collecting time, you cannot make 24 or even 2 pictures a second. You can only make 1 picture every second, because you want to expose each picture for 1 second. If you want to have an exposure time of 5 seconds, you can only make 1 picture every 5 seconds. So this was the reason why I was making this connection between shutter speed and frame rate. And the example with a serial mode and the sweater was just another example. If you shorten your shutter speed from a 24th of a second, make it faster to 100th of a second, you are able to make more pictures, like 100 each second. But if the sweater movement is only a 10th of a second, of course you only can make 10 pictures with the serial mode, because each picture has 100th of a second multiplied 10 times 100th of a second results in a 10th of a second, which is the whole time of the sweater. I hope I didn't confuse you any more, but this was the explanation. Okay, we were just talking about the lowest threshold of the lowest able shutter speed, or the longest exposure time you can have, which was the exact opposing value of the frame rate, which means if a fly refreshes its view 100 times a second, it cannot has a longer exposure time than 100th of a second. But of course you can have a shorter exposure time. For example, if the fly makes 100 pictures a second, you only have to expose each picture like a 10,000th of a second. That's possible. So again, let's go away from the serial mode. Just take one single picture. One single picture has basically any exposure time which you want. It can be very long or it can be super short. Let's come to the effects of the shutter speed. Can you remember when I told about the car on the street? It's open your shutter and then you take all these positions of the car and merge it into one picture. If I tell you the question, how can you show a viewer of the picture whether the car you took on the street was a parked car or a moving car? How can you do this? Because the viewer only sees one still image of the situation. How does the viewer knows what was moving in the picture and what was still? I don't have a car right now, but I can take this thing, okay? I make two pictures now, and you tell me in which picture I moved the thing and in which picture was it still, okay? Here are the two pictures. So I guess it was totally easy for you to distinguish. Why? Because of the motion blur. You instinctively knew in which picture this thing was moving. And this you can do with the shutter speed because the shutter controls the motion blur. And now we go back to the original video. Maybe you already know all this. Basically what I want to say, the shutter speed controls the motion blur of a moving object, okay? Whoops. I'm scared. Of course, if you have a static object, you can have a shutter speed as long as you want. If it's not moving, there is no blur, okay? And you as a creator, you make a conscious decision about this. For example, if you are a sports photographer, okay, and you want to freeze the moment super sharp without motion blur, you need a very fast shutter speed, or put it in another way, the exposure time must be very short that you have no motion blur, because you want to freeze that 1/1000th of a second when he hits the ball or whatever. If you're a nature photographer and you want to make picture of the moving clouds or of moving water, and you want to have a very soft moving, you don't want sharp edges, you make a very long exposure time, which means a very slow shutter speed. The shutter is moving not slow, it's just exposing very long and it takes long time to close again. Then you don't have sharp edges of the clouds or of the water. Maybe you have seen these pictures with these waterfalls where it just looks like, I don't know the English word, Schleier, Wheel. Okay, so it's called a wheel, like from a bride, you know. So it's hazy, the waterfall. So if you want this as a photographer, you adjust the shutter speed accordingly. If you want sharp clouds, you choose a very short shutter speed. What I want to say, this is a conscious decision of you and it has nothing to do with the exposure. What I want to say with this, for a photographer or an artist, the priority of the adjustment of a shutter speed is the look of the picture. How much motion blur do I want? And only secondary, it's the exposure. Good. The next thing is the aperture. Therefore, let's make a little test. Close one eye, because we only need one, then it's like a lens from one camera. And put your finger in front of your opened eye, okay? And then focus on your finger. Okay. And look at the background. How does the background look like? The background is blurry, right? And if you focus on the background and put your finger a little bit away, you see that the background is sharp, but the finger is totally blurry, right? And basically, you cannot change this. You cannot say, I want to see everything sharp. You cannot do this. You have to focus as a human. And guess what? The camera can change this. If you want, you can make pictures where your finger is sharp and the background is sharp. You can do this. This is your choice again. This is called the depth of field. What is field? Basically, everything, the world around us, or every picture, every motive, contains out of a foreground, which is very near to the camera, a middle ground, and the background, which is very far from the camera. It's like layers. The whole picture contains out of layers. And the depth means how many of these layers are in focus. Or the depth that says how far can the distances be between these layers to be still sharp, okay? Or make it easy, if one layer, let's say we only have 3, the foreground, if this is sharp, shall the middle ground also be sharp, yes or no? And or shall the background also be sharp, okay? And it's the same with the shutter speed. For you as a photographer or an artist, this is priority number 1 when you adjust the aperture. How shall the look be of your picture? For example, if you make pictures of a model, the model is important, okay? The background is totally not important, so you want the background to be blurry in 99% of the cases. If you're a landscape photographer and you have an interesting whatever stone or flower in the foreground, and you have a super interesting mountain on the background, you want both to be sharp. So it's a conscious decision of you to choose an aperture that the whole picture is sharp, all the layers, the foreground is sharp and the background is sharp. And again, to use the aperture for the exposure is only your second priority. Good. Let's come to the ISO. The ISO has no impact on the look of the picture. So the ISO is not used for artistic purposes. Good. Short summary, the aperture and the shutter speed, they change the look of your picture and the ISO doesn't. Okay. So what happens in a perfect world? You as a creator, as a photographer, you use the dream aperture, what your heart wants, and you use your desired shutter speed. And you have the perfect picture. No, unfortunately not. Because this is the moment that you remember, damn, the shutter speed and the aperture also have an impact on my exposure, whether you want it or not. So it might be the case, which is in most of the cases the case, that your picture is either too bright or too dark. What you do now? Okay, you might say now, hey, wait. There is this thing called ISO, right? We can use the ISO to let more light in and then the picture isn't too dark anymore. Theoretically, yes, but there is one downside. I also already mentioned in the last video, the ISO, especially the higher ISO numbers, they reduce the quality of your picture. Which means you can use the ISO to a certain amount, but not like as much as you want. And basically this is a major reason, not the only reason, but this is a major reason why expensive cameras are expensive. Because they have a very high quality, very light sensitive sensor, which needs much less light in comparison to a cheap camera, to a cheap sensor, to expose your picture right. Which means if you need less ISO, a smaller ISO number, to get the same amount of light into your camera, your pictures have less noise than compared to a cheap camera with a not so light sensitive sensor. And it also means if you have an expensive good camera with a good sensor, you can even use higher ISO numbers and the picture still has less noise than from a cheap camera with a not so good sensor. So regarding the noise, a light sensitive sensor produces better quality than a sensor with not so high light sensitivity, which has nothing to do with the details. You remember, regarding the details, the amount of pixels, the megapixels of a sensor, define the quality of a camera. The more pixels, the more details you see. Actually, both is important, okay? And we haven't even talked about the sharpness, which is, in most of the cases, the work of the lens, of the objective you use for a camera. There's so many stuff, oh man. Is it crazy? Like sharpness and details is also not the same. For example, you can have a super sharp picture, which means your focus is on point, but you don't have much details because you don't have enough megapixels. Wow, this is a bucket without a bottom. It's local. Okay. By the way, here is a comparison example from this camera I'm filming right now. It's a picture with an ISO of 3200 and the same motive made with my crappy phone. Same ISO, you see much more noise because, yeah, the sensor is way worse in the phone than in the camera, of course. So you may say now, yeah, good to know that, but I cannot afford an expensive camera with a super light sensitive sensor. What shall I do? Yeah, welcome in the world of a photographer. The answer is what you should do. You have to sacrifice something. What you have to sacrifice? One or even both of your artistic choices you made. You remember I said in a perfect world, you choose your dream aperture and your dream shutter speed and you're good to go. Well, if you use then the ISO, for example, if your picture is way too dark, but the ISO which you should need for the right exposure makes way too much noise, then you have to sacrifice either your aperture and or your shutter speed. Which means you have to sacrifice your chosen depth of field and or your chosen motion blur. Because remember, I said the priority number one of the artist or the photographer is the look, the choice, how many motion blur or how many layers in my picture do I want to have sharp. But if the ISO is not capable to exposing your picture right without getting too much noise, you have to come to the secondary priority of the aperture and the shutter speed, and this means you have to use one or both of them to adjust your exposure. Which means at the same time your look will change. That's how it is. Okay. Here a little summary where we came from. We came from this and the last video that the aperture, the shutter speed and the ISO, they all control the amount of light, which means they all control the brightness of the picture, which means they all control the exposure of your picture. Good. Then we have learned, hey, wait, what? The aperture and the shutter speed, they can change the look of your picture. So we said, hey, okay. I will use the shutter speed and the exposure, the aperture, not for exposure reasons. I just use it for creative purposes, okay? And then reality came around the corner and hit us hard and said, yeah, no, my friendo. Unfortunately, your camera is too bad to just use the ISO to adjust the exposure. So you have to sacrifice your motion blur or your depth of field. Take a deep breath. This is a problem we all have to deal with. Well, this is a real first world problem, right? Okay, anyway. So, what is my perfect workflow to find your right exposure with these three things? Which is basically the topic of this video, right? Okay, so how do I start? The first thing I adjust is my ISO value. Why? Very easy. Basically, there are two reasons. First, the ISO is neutral regarding to your artistic choices. And second, I just bluntly try to get the best quality, which means I choose the lowest ISO number my camera is able to shoot in, which means the least noise, which also means it's the darkest setting. You remember, the lower the ISO number, the more light is needed, which is daytime in most of the cases no problem because you have enough light. As an experienced photographer, you already know that probably you will be not able to hold that low ISO number when you make pictures in the dark or in the evening or where it's not so much light. But maybe you find another solution like a tripod or whatever. We talk about this later. And why am I proposing this workflow? It is an algorithm you can always use, okay? No matter how the conditions are, where you make your picture, this workflow you can use always. And you have the advantage, especially at daytime, you will save time later because you don't have to go back and adjust the other settings when you realize you have so much light that you can use the lowest ISO number, and when you adjust it in the end and the picture is still too bright, it's overexposed, you have to go back and adjust the other things. And this step you save if you put the lowest ISO number at the first step which you take. Good. The second thing what you do is you choose this artistic choice which is the most important for you. For example, is the depth of field the most important for you? Then you choose the aperture. If the amount of motion blur is the most important thing for you, the shutter speed is the first thing you adjust how you want it. Good. The third thing you adjust is basically the other thing which is left. So have you adjusted the aperture in the first place? You now adjust the shutter speed and the other way around. If the other thing is not so important for you, so if the aperture is very important and you adjusted this and you don't really take care about the shutter speed and vice versa, you can adjust it freely as you want until your exposure is perfect, because your ISO is already at the lowest point. This is the situation where I told you now you can save time because you already have the best quality because you adjusted the ISO in the first place. And now you just take the second thing like shutter speed or aperture and dial it as long as your exposure is perfect. You may ask now, yeah, well, but this was an easy case. What if both things are important for me? The aperture and the shutter speed? Well, no problem. Adjust the second thing, what is left, as your heart desires it, which is like your dream setup as you want it as a creator. And then you look at the exposure. What does it say? First, let's start with a special case, which is very seldom the case, that your picture is still too bright, okay? It's still overexposed. What can you do? The ISO we already put on the lowest value, which makes the picture ISO-wise the darkest you can get, but it's still overexposed. So you cannot use the ISO anymore. So you have two choices. First one, you sacrifice again the least important of your choices, which means if the aperture is not so important for you, you just crank up the f-stop number to make it darker, to block more light out of the camera. If the motion blur is not so super important for you, you can make the shutter speed faster, which means you shorten the exposure time to let less light in. If both options are definitely a no-go for you, then you only have the additional option to use an external filter, which is basically a dark glass, and you see, you can look through it and it just makes your picture darker, you see? Okay, but as I already told you, this is like a special case because you can ask, I think 99% of the photographer, they say, yeah, this is a luxury problem to have too much light, okay? And I think all of them prefer this situation than what is in 95% of all the cases the case, which means with the actual setup, with the lowest ISO number, your picture is underexposed, which means you have not enough light at disposal to get the right exposure for your pictures, which means you have to go to the fourth step of my workflow. It's adjusting your ISO. You remember, I were so arrogant to say, okay, we start with the best quality. We start with the lowest ISO number and try how far we can get. So obviously, in this case, we have to sacrifice the quality because we have to raise the ISO number to make our sensor, as I already told, we cannot make it more light sensitive. We just have to change the interpretation, how the sensor interprets the light which it gets. So here is something which you should do with all of your cameras, which means if you have a camera, you do it with the camera. If you have a phone, you should also do it with the phone, which is figuring out your pain barrier concerning or regarding the ISO, okay? You can remember these two pictures I showed you with the ISO 3200, which means for a good camera, I don't have a problem to shoot with a 3200 if it's necessary. For my phone, the pain barrier is way lower because a 3200 ISO picture with the phone looks just awful, okay? So I cannot use this. So you should make test pictures with all ISOs you have, and then you just should remember what is the highest acceptable ISO number, quality-wise, noise-wise, which you can accept for this camera, and remember this. And yeah, so the question is now, what should you do if your acceptable ISO number is still not sufficient to get a right exposure? Your picture is still too dark, although you cranked up the ISO to the number which you are willing to use. In this case, you also have several choices. One choice, for example, would be to try, can I use a tripod? The advantage of a tripod is the camera don't shake at all if you have a good tripod, which means in many cases you are able to make a longer or to use a longer exposure time because your camera doesn't shake. You as a person, you are able to hold the camera maybe a fifth of a second or an 80th of a second. You're able to hold the camera stable. And it's maybe also, or what means maybe, it's definitely also the case how far the things are away from the camera which you want to focus, and also what your focal length is. Because if you make a picture of an object which is very far away, you know that a way fewer movement of the camera is already enough to get a not sharp picture. And if you make a close-up of something, you can make more shakes with the camera and the picture is still sharp, relatively sharp, okay? But just let's assume that you don't have any of these things, like use a tripod or just shoot it at another time or whatever. You just have to do it now and you cannot use any of these tricks. Sorry to tell you that. You only have the chance to make a second iteration of that workflow and sacrifice another fraction of your aperture choice or your shutter speed choice to get more light into your camera. Yeah. So this is basically the reason why pro photographers pay a huge amount of money to buy super expensive, super high quality cameras to be able to sacrifice less of their artistic choices. Wow, this was a good sentence. Okay, but don't worry, with a better camera, you get technically better quality pictures, okay? From a technical standpoint, but you don't get more interesting pictures, okay? I mean, how often have you worked through an art gallery and said, wow, this is a technical, very perfect picture? I mean, as I already told you, I was super impressed by this boxer picture in the Madison Square Garden because it has just so much details. Okay. But other things like composition or an interesting camera angle or the motive itself or whatever, all these things are way more important than the technical perfection of your picture. Whew, lots of stuff today. Okay, we have one open question. Why not use the automatic mode? Because the automatic mode can do everything on its own. The automatic mode chooses the aperture, chooses the shutter speed, chooses the ISO. Well, maybe you already have an idea why the shutter speed is not a super good idea. Because in such situations where you cannot get the ideal picture because we are not living in an ideal world, the automatic of your camera doesn't know what you want to sacrifice, okay? The automatic mode doesn't know how do you want to get this waterfall. You want this wheel or you want sharp drops, okay? The automatic doesn't know this. And because the automatic has no idea, the automatic uses just values in the middle, okay? What does this mean? I have 3 examples. Imagine it's getting dark outside, like now. What does the automatic do? In many cases, it starts with the ISO and just cranks it up. But what if you say, no, I want a super noise-free picture. This is the most important thing for me. I'd rather sacrifice my aperture or my shutter speed, but I want no noise in my picture. I want the lowest ISO number. The camera doesn't know this. Or the opposite case. It's getting super dark outside and the camera says, okay, I don't want to crank up the ISO anymore because I know it's getting noisier and noisier, and maybe my cameraman, my user, doesn't want this. So I just stopped at a certain ISO level and go on with lowering the shutter speed, which means the exposure time gets longer to get more light in and make the picture brighter with this method. Yeah, the problem is, if you want to make a picture of a moving object and you don't want motion blur, you already learned the longer the exposure time, the bigger the motion blur. So if you don't want motion blur, you really want to keep that shutter speed as fast as you can. And there are lots of photographers out there who say, I'd rather have a super sharp picture with lots of noise, because noise reduction in the post-production in photo editing software is way easier than removing motion blur. Good luck with this. But the camera doesn't know what motive are you taking a picture of. Is it moving? Is it not moving? It's always using the same algorithm. Or even if you have not a moving object, okay, you make a picture from the park with the trees, okay, and you have to have the camera still in your hand, okay. As I already told, a person is not able to hold the camera still really stable for shorter than like a 50th of a second, okay. But the camera, the automatic mode, easily lowers the shutter speed for to a 30th of a second, which is a little bit lower, or the exposure time is a little bit longer, then you can hold it still. So you will have automatically a not sharp, blurry picture, because you cannot hold the camera still for so long without a tripod. Okay, but let's leave the field of sacrifices. Imagine your daylight, super bright day, no problem. You don't have to sacrifice anything. The camera still don't know which look you want to achieve. Remember the example with the finger, okay? The camera doesn't know how sharp shall be the background, which depth of field you want. You want a sharp background? You want a deep depth of field? Or you want a super blurry background and only your finger is sharp, which means you want a shallow depth of field. The camera doesn't know, but it has to make a choice. And in many cases, the choice is just somewhere in the middle, like the camera takes an aperture of 4.5 or something, which is neither a deep nor a shallow depth of field. It just looks blah, it's just boring. So basically, the whole thing with the automatic mode boils down to two problems. Either the picture is technically not good, because the choice that the automatic mode makes, like lowering the shutter speed to an amount where you cannot hold your camera still anymore, or making just choices somewhere in the middle, like a middle aperture or a middle shutter speed or whatever, that the artistic value of the picture just gets lost because the viewer cannot capture a statement of the picture. Basically, the picture doesn't make a statement because, for example, with an conscious decision of choosing a super shallow depth of field or a super deep depth of field, or with a clearly recognizable strong motion blur or no motion blur, whatever you want. So this is the reason why many of these automatic mode pictures look mediocre, because just the statement is missing, okay? Woo! Lots of stuff today again. Lots of stuff. Wow. Lots of stuff. Wow. Thanks for paying so long attention. If you think this video was total crap, then give it a thumbs down. And if it was helpful for you, or you think this might be helpful for other people, then I'd really appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up. This will help me and the other persons who clicked this video. And I think there are people already out there who ask like, oh wait, okay, so now I understood everything what a photographer have to take into consideration with the ISO, aperture and shutter speed. But what is with the videographer? Like what I'm doing basically right now, making a video. Does the same rule applies for filmmaking? The short answer is basically yes, but there is one huge exception. And this is a very good idea for the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.